Hey y'all, this is episode number 14. Thank you so much to Flavor Ray who created the intro music you're about to listen to. Their EP release party is tomorrow night, May 31st at Stubbs here in Austin, Texas. And their new single Ghost in Me is available on Spotify and all streaming platforms. What's up, y'all? This is the Sovereign Individual Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Guerra. Thank you so much for being here and giving this a listen. I really appreciate it. As I've said time and time again, it's encouraging to see a few more people downloading it every so often. So slow growth. We're doing what we can. If you are enjoying the podcast so far, please go ahead and subscribe, rate, and review the show if you haven't already. And share it with anybody that you think would be interested in listening to these viewpoints, these liberty ideas, all this kind of good stuff. And again, the conversations that are coming here shortly down the road as I get started on those. So really appreciate it and really love that we at least have some people listening. And again, this is really cathartic for me. So if it never goes anywhere, so be it. So today I wanted to talk about the media and the corporate media and kind of how I mentioned, I can't remember exactly how I referred to it in the Memorial Day episode. I think I referred to them getting trolled again. I don't know. I don't remember if that was the exact way that I put it. That's kind of the sentiment that I'm getting at. They're not necessarily trolled in the sense that not like they're getting trolled with like the AOK sign, the holding your index and your thumb together in a circle and the three fingers up, how they got trolled into thinking that was a white supremacist symbol. Not in that way, but just trolled into the idea of war again. And trolled into believing a false narrative that they use to then beat the drums of war. So we're going to get into that right now and talking about an issue that I mentioned, I know in a previous episode. I can't remember which one. Kind of hard to keep it all straight. It was just thrown out there as an aside where I talked about how it was very interesting that the chemical weapons attacks by the Syrian government so quickly fell out of the narrative of the corporate media as soon as holes started kind of being poked into them. So I'm a little late on this. This has actually been out for about 2 weeks now. But again, nobody in the corporate media is talking about it. So it's kind of hard to come across unless you run in certain circles on social media and you see, certain individuals that are willing to talk about this kind of stuff and aren't necessarily reporters at mainstream publications, but are trustworthy reporters nonetheless. So a leaked document came out that was from the OPCW. And what exactly is that acronym again? So let's see here. It is, let me pull that up real quick. I can't remember exactly. It's what the organization specifically, the acronym stands for. So I've got their report pulled up, but they even just refer to themselves as, there it is. Okay, so it is the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. So OPCW. So there's a leaked document that came out that casts doubt on the official findings of the investigation into Syria. And so what's interesting is there was an official report that came out, and that was a much longer report, and I didn't really want to dive into that specifically because the OPCW offered on their main website kind of a general summary of it and what exactly their findings were. And so I was just going to kind of go off of that. And so basically, here is what they have to say. So they have a fact-finding mission. They refer to it as an FFM. So they had a fact-finding mission go in to investigate the alleged use of chemical weapons in Douma, Syria, on April 7th of 2018. And so here is from their findings, from their fact-finding report, this is from their official website, just kind of a general overview of it. And so it says, regarding the alleged use of toxic chemicals as a weapon in Douma, the evaluation and analysis of all the above referenced information gathered by the FFM provide reasonable grounds that the use of a toxic chemical as a weapon has taken place on 7 April 2018. The toxic chemical contained reactive chlorine. The toxic chemical was likely molecular chlorine. Now you notice there it doesn't talk at all about blame. It doesn't say who is responsible, I guess would be the better way to put it. It doesn't talk about responsibility at all. And there's a reason for that, which is listed here, or spoken about here, just a few paragraphs down. It says, the FFM's mandate is to determine whether chemical weapons or toxic chemicals as weapons have been used in Syria. It does not include identifying who is responsible for alleged attacks. The FFM is required to study available information relating to the allegations of the use of chemical weapons in Syria, including information provided by the Syrian Arab Republic and others. And then it goes on to talk about employees' investigative methods. So they, so they're saying that, that's not their responsibility to say who is responsible, which is kind of an interesting thing in and of itself. But there's a document that is leaked, and it was buried by the OPCW and has since been confirmed. So it was confirmed that this document is legitimate, and so it was confirmed via email when reached out to for comment. The OPCW sent out this in response. They sent a really long thing, but the pertinent paragraph is this specific one. It says, pursuant to its established policies and practices, the OPCW Technical Secretariat is conducting an internal investigation about the unauthorized release of the document in question. So that's them saying that we're doing an internal investigation, which means this document is legitimate. We're trying to figure out how it got released to the public and who was the one responsible for releasing it. The validity can be shown as well in the fact that the main name involved in the report is one Ian Henderson, who is confirmed to be part of the fact-finding mission there. So that is valid in and of itself. It can be confirmed that Ian Henderson is employed by the OPCW and was part of this fact-finding mission. So what does it say? It's not a long document. It's about 15 pages. It goes into how they conducted their research, kind of what it came down to, the different methods that they use, and they were specifically kind of investigating the cylinders that were found that contained chlorine, and kind of how they would have been, whether or not it was possible that they were dropped from an aircraft, which would infer that it was the Syrian government that did that. They're the ones with access to helicopters and jets that could have done such a thing, or if the cylinders were placed there from the ground, whether they were dropped or whether they were placed there. So it's a big deal, because if the Syrian government is responsible for this, as people were claiming, and if Assad is the one who gasses on people, as they were claiming, during this attack, so this attack occurred on April 7th, And it was part of like a final push by the Syrian government to defeat the rebels. Douma was like the last holdout. So they bombarded Douma and they bombed it severely. They used an airstrike to do so. So that's not in question. What's in question is if these cylinders were not dropped from airplanes, then it was not the Syrian government that did this. So that's where this comes from. That's what this is all about. So, assessment from the report. Again, this was buried. It says on this report, do not circulate, but this was not included in the official report released by the OPCW, and it was not talked about at all. Again, they have their mandate of not identifying who's to blame, but this is important information. So this is the assessment from Mr. Ian Henderson. At this stage, the FFM engineering subteam cannot be certain that the cylinders at either location arrived there as a result of being dropped from an aircraft. The dimensions, characteristics, and appearance of the cylinders and the surrounding scene of the incidents were inconsistent with what would have been expected in the case of either cylinder having been delivered from an aircraft. In each case, the alternative hypothesis produced the only plausible explanation for observations at the scene. In summary, observations at the scene of the two locations, together with subsequent analysis, suggest that there is a higher probability that both cylinders were manually placed at those two locations rather than being delivered from aircraft. So essentially what you got here is they did a bunch of studies. They used concrete and 3D models and all kinds of different methods in order to test whether or not these cylinders were dropped from an aircraft. And they were testing it, from being dropped from 500 meters up to 2,000, and they were finding that at nowhere was what they were seeing at the sites matching up with what should have occurred were they to have been dropped from aircraft. So again, this is a big deal because this implies that the Syrian government is not responsible, which, if we go through the timeline, which we're about to do, most of us recognized from the jump that this makes no sense. None of this makes sense. This seems like a false flag. So let's go over the timeline. April 7, 2018 is when this attack on Douma occurred. Again, like I said earlier, this was part of the final push from the Syrian government. So there's 40 deaths that occurred as a result of this specific chemical portion of the attack that we're talking about. And again, chlorine was present. So it's not in doubt as to whether or not there was chemicals present. And what we're talking about is who was responsible ultimately. So let's look at what else was going on right around this time. And so I have an article here from the New York Times. Not that I think they're a particularly upstanding news organization. There we are. Gosh, blanking a little bit today. It's been a little bit of a long day. Not that I think they're upstanding, but they are hyperly critical of Trump, and so certain things, it may just be better. And they were, this was an article I was able to find fairly easily. There was one talking about the exact same thing from ABC News. I just found the New York Times one first, and it kind of has it wrapped up more succinctly and with less quotes directly from Trump. So anytime I don't have to quote him directly, I think works out a little bit better. And I would like to think we're going to get a little bit better grammar and word usage if I'm just speaking myself and then just kind of reiterating some basic things from an article. So April 4th, 2018, this is 3 days before this attack occurs. President Trump, this is from the New York Times again. President Trump has instructed his military commanders to quickly wrap up the American military operation in Syria so that he can bring troops home within a few months. And this was the article title, Trump drops push for immediate withdrawal of troops from Syria. So they follow that up with, he dropped his insistence on an immediate withdrawal, they said. This is administration officials, is the they're referring to. dropped his insistence on an immediate withdrawal, they said, after commanders told them they needed time to complete their mission. So it's known that Trump is intent on pulling our troops out of Syria 3 days before this attack occurs. Douma is the last stronghold of the rebels in Syria. The Syrian government has won. There's three groups, rebel groups within this region. Two of them agreed to like a ceasefire agreement and like a peace agreement and kind of a surrender, if you will, with the Syrian government. Douma, the rebel group there, was holding out. So the Syrian government on April 7th attacks Douma, and they use airstrikes. I think the airstrike was like 6 hours long or something like that. They leveled it pretty thoroughly to defeat this final rebel group. So the American military is intending to pull out. The Syrian government is making a final push on the final stronghold of the rebels that they've been fighting this civil war with. They've won. This is it. They beat out this last remaining group, and there's no more rebels, no more strongholds that they have to contend with. So I am expected to believe that Assad, knowing that President Trump intended to pull American troops out of Syria, knowing that this is the last rebel stronghold that he needs to defeat in order to be victorious in this war, is going, and knowing what the response would be for using chemical weapons and that it would bring the West back into this conflict. We bombed them 6 days later, I believe. It may have been even sooner than that, but we bombed chemical weapons sites within Syria, or suspected chemical weapons sites within Syria, bombed them fairly heavily. So there was a heavy retaliatory response to this. So you're telling me Assad, knowing that what the response would be, dropped chemical weapons in Douma to kill 40 people, 40 civilians, when he's got the war in hand. And when he's got the President of the United States telling his military commanders to finish up what they need to do to be able to pull out of Syria. That doesn't add up. In no way does that add up. This isn't a complicated thing, you know. Just Occam's razor it. What's the simplest explanation? Who would benefit and gain the most from a chemical attack occurring? It's not the Syrian government. It's not Assad's regime that would benefit from this. It's the rebels. They would benefit from the West being drawn into this and getting into it with Assad's government and the government forces and the Syrian government forces, and then they would be able to. The goal being that if the U.S. comes in and overthrows Assad, then the rebels have a chance to fill that power vacuum. And now that we're seeing this report that was buried, that shows that it is far more likely that they weren't able to recreate the conditions through their testing that would show these cylinders were dropped from aircraft. Who do you think put these cylinders there? Who do you think carried out this attack, or just put them in places where they knew that would be targets for the Syrian government to bomb so that they would go off? The rebels. Well, most of us were saying at the time when this was happening, because it doesn't need to be complicated. Just look at this. It makes no sense to drop chemical weapons that kill 40 people when you've got the war won, and the biggest threat is saying that they want to leave. No sense whatsoever. Didn't make sense then. Sure as hell doesn't make sense now. And this report makes a hell of a lot more sense. Because that's exactly who would benefit. Is the rebels on the ground. So, that was the timeline. That was what we were looking at as far as Douma goes. Now, why is the mainstream media not talking about this? Well, there's one person that has talked about this. Again, I had plenty of qualms with Tucker Carlson. There's a lot that he says, especially about capitalism, that's been very wrong lately. But he is the only main person, in the mainstream media, in the nighttime prime time slot, and I think it shows on at 8 p.m. that is strongly anti-war and makes no qualms about it and talks about it constantly. So of course, he's the only person I've seen that talked about it at all. And he had a guest on to talk about it as well, and that is my girl Tulsi Gabbard. So let's listen real quick to what Tucker and Tulsi had to say about this, because it answers that question of why the media is not talking about this. So give me just a sec.
Now, a leaked document shows there was good reason to be skeptical. The OPCW is the world's top chemical weapons watchdog. In a leaked internal document, an investigator with that organization argued that the evidence from Douma does not indicate an aerial attack. Instead, he argued, the chemical weapons were manually placed on the ground. That suggests the attack may not have been a government operation after all. If he's right, the United States went to the brink of war based on fraudulent information, and not for the first time. Tulsi Gabbard is a Democratic member of Congress from Hawaii, the first female combat veteran ever to run for president, and she joins us tonight.
Aloha, Tucker.
Congresswoman, as you say. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.
You're someone else who's taken an enormous amount of heat, an enormous amount of criticism, I can't overstate it, for asking skeptical questions about our policy toward Syria. How do you assess this leaked document? What does it make you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is a significant and very important development we've got to take seriously. As you mentioned, I initially expressed some skepticism around that whole situation, which is why I am getting more information, reaching out to the UN, reaching out to the OPCW, and getting answers. And when I get those answers, I look forward to coming back and sharing them with you and with your viewers.
So we're hearing again, even this week, that we may need to bomb Syria yet again, because there may be yet another chemical weapons attack. So there'll be 3 years in a row, always in the spring, and always within the context of some other international question. I'm beginning to suspect that we're being played here. Has that occurred to you?
Once again, I mean, this is why doing our due diligence and checking very carefully the evidence is so important. I want to bring up another issue that is extremely important to the American people right now, and that is something that should concern all of us, which is the fact that we're at the brink of a war with Iran. I can tell you, as a soldier, I've served over 16 years in the Army National Guard. I've deployed twice to the Middle East. I know very well both the Middle East as well as the cost of war. And as a member of Congress on the Armed Services and Foreign Affairs Committees for over 6 years, I know where this path leads us. And I'm concerned because the American people don't seem to be prepared for how devastating and costly such a war would be.
And that's why. That right there, Tulsi just explained exactly why nobody else in the mainstream media is talking about this. Because they're beating the drums for war with Iran right now as we speak. They want that war. Bolton wants that war. Pompeo wants that war. Luckily, Trump seems at least hesitant to get us into that war. And if they are to admit that a war we almost got into a year ago, again, Tucker was saying this would be the third year in a row. 2017, we were fed the same thing. 2013, we were fed the same lie about these chemical attacks, which are proven to have not been carried out by the Assad government time and time again. They're trying to lie us into another war. And they're using these rebel groups, which are funded by the CIA, which are armed and trained by the CIA in order to do so. So yeah, I mean, they may be acting independently in some regards, but where do you think they get these ideas and this training from? We taught Osama bin Laden in the 80s how to get Russia into an extended war with a third world country like Afghanistan and how it can cripple their economy. And what did he turn around and do? He dragged the United States into a never-ending war in the Middle East. We teach these rebel groups this kind of stuff, and then they use it against us. So this is what's happening right now. We're being lied into another war, this time with Iran. We've been told for decades now that they're so close to getting a nuclear weapon, that they're that close. No, they're not. They've never been. They've never been close to getting a nuclear weapon. It's been the policy of their leadership, of the God, why am I blanking now? I want to say caliphate, but I don't think that's right. But it's been their policy that they do not want to make a nuclear weapon. So we've been fed this lie, and then they were holding up their end of the Iran agreement before we pulled out. So they're feeding us, they're trying to lie us into another war right now with Iran. And do not think for a second that this will be some sort of easy war that's going to be, they're going to roll over and let us take them over, and it's going to be a short war. They told us that about Iraq. Look at how that turned out. We're still in Afghanistan. You know, I mean, a lot of that has to do with the opioid fields there and making sure that we get our citizens continue to be hooked on opioids. So that plays a large role in why we're still in Afghanistan, but that's neither here nor there. The fact of the matter is if we get into a conflict with Iran, it will last over a decade. It will last as long as these other wars have. And there will be no end in sight. And it will be bloody, and it will be costly, and it will bring us on the brink of World War III, because we've got two other major superpowers who have a vested interest in Iran. Again, Russia and China. We talked about this before, and how they're interested in investing into Iran and building it up. So if you don't think for a second that there's going to be tension with those countries who have a vested interest now, I mean, again, it's their goal to have a foothold in the region, just as the United States does. I'm not excusing the actions of any other government here. I despise them as much as I despise what the United States government does. They're all the state. You know, I don't like the state. I loathe the state. So they're all the state. But let's stop pretending as if we can't understand why they are doing what they're doing. I mean, just imagine if imagine if Russia put nukes on the border of Canada like we have with Poland. Imagine if Russia were to invade, I don't know, Venezuela, Brazil, a South American country, and then hold influence over that region and refuse to allow the United States to conduct business there or to have any allies there. I mean, it's really not hard to understand why other players are acting in the way that they do when you discover what American foreign policy actually does. It's kind of the same way, like, I could never understand when I was younger why 9/11 happened. I was always confused. I was like, we helped bin Laden in the 80s. We helped Afghanistan fight the Russians, but fight the USSR. Why do they hate us so much? Why do people in the Middle East hate America so much? And I thought that for a while. And then you realize, okay, well, first of all, we trained Osama bin Laden to do exactly what he did. And he drew us into a never-ending conflict in the Middle East. So we taught him how to do that, first of all, like I mentioned earlier. But second of all, you realize, oh yeah, the CIA admitted that they overthrew the democratically elected government in Iran. You realize that we've had our foothold within the Middle East in all kinds of different ways. You realize that we went into Iraq on in defense of Kuwait, quote unquote, in order to fight Saddam Hussein. You realize that we put economic sanctions on Iraq that killed 500,000 children. And so it all kind of starts to make sense. Like, oh, of course there's this feeling of hatred towards the United States because we've decided who we're going to overthrow, who we're going to prop up, even if it's not in the best interest of those people. If we're going to reinstate a dictatorial Shah in Iran because he's more friendly to the United States. And so it's like, yeah, of course they view the United States government as this awful thing. It's been screwing up their part of the world for decades now. It's been getting involved in ways that it shouldn't have been. And so it's just to think that these outside actors are crazy or nothing. What they're doing doesn't make sense. It's just intellectually dishonest. They just take a step back for a second and think of how the United States would react if another country were to act in the same manner that the United States government does. And it's really not that hard to see why things are shaking out the way that they are. It's really not hard to see why Russia is so interested in both Iran and Syria. Because they want a foothold in the region as well. They want allies in that region that they can use to try to influence the region. And we're being sucked right into it. We're being lied into another conflict. Another armed conflict. So that's why they can't report on this. Because they tried to lie us into one with Syria for years in a row now. 2013 they tried. 2017 they tried. 2018 they tried. And every single time, as soon as holes start getting poked in that chemical story, it disappears. And they don't talk about it. And then you never hear anything about it again. Isn't that interesting? And I'm sure the only reason you didn't hear about the original OPCW report was because it didn't specifically assign blame, so they couldn't use it as a prop up to say, see, we were right, it was the Assad government. And again, this is a bureaucratic organization, the OPCW. Guess who one of the biggest biggest members are? And I'm sure who funds most of it is the United States. So this is a bureaucracy. It's a bunch of unelected people that work there. They get their commands from the higher up who want to please one of the biggest members, aka vis-a-vis the United States. So of course they bury the thing that proves not without a doubt, but proves pretty substantially that the Syrian government did not drop it. Although you don't even need the proof because, like I said earlier, if you just think about it logically, it made no sense. So of course they bury that because they want to please the United States. Simple bureaucracy. And then all it takes is one person who's being like, no, this is bullshit. And they release the document. And thank God that they did. But again, you're not going to hear about it anywhere. Like I said, I'm 2 weeks late on this. This broke on May 16th. It's just super frustrating that they're trying to lie us into another war. And it's disgusting. And I really can't fathom why Trump has, after his rhetoric on the campaign trail and how anti-war he was and how he talked about how dumb these wars are and why we needed to end them, how he could possibly put war hawks like Bolton and Pompeo into his administration. It baffles me. But that's why it's not getting talked about. So again, just stay vigilant. Dig deeper. Be aware. Seek out this information. It's out there if you look for it. The problem is that most Americans don't want to look for it. As Tulsi was saying, most Americans are oblivious to this kind of stuff that's going on. And if the mainstream media isn't presenting it, even with their spin, there's an obvious spin in the corporate media. But if the corporate media doesn't present it, then a lot of Americans aren't even going to be aware of it. So it's our jobs as sovereign individuals to make ourselves aware of it, to seek this information out, to not have the wool pulled over our eyes. Take the red pill. Learn how deep the rabbit hole goes. God, I love the Matrix. But no, I mean, seriously, like, that's the thing. Once you realize how the government likes to, how the state and the government likes to manipulate things, how the media is a huge proponent of that. And again, it's the corporate media. They're corporations. So, there's a lot of people who are very anti-corporation. Don't forget that the media is exactly that. And they have a role to play. And that is predominantly as microphones and parroters of whatever the government and the state needs them to be. So that's it. Just remain vigilant. Be aware that this kind of stuff is going on. Be aware that they are trying to lie us into more conflicts in the Middle East. I, for one, am sick of it. I'm sick of my tax dollars going to bombing people. I'm sick of middle-class Americans sending their sons and daughters to die in these wars. And I'm sick of being fed this fighting for our freedom crap. There's no threat to our freedom in Iran right now. There's no threat to our freedom in Iraq right now. There's no threat to our freedom in Afghanistan right now. You know what would probably really help to secure this, like the safety of our freedom? Let's stop funding rebel groups that turn into terrorist organizations in the Middle East. Let's stop arming them and let's stop training them. And let's leave the damn region alone. And if Israel wants a war with Iran so goddamn bad, they can fight it. Let them fight it. We're not going to fight Israel's war. We're not going to war with Iran because Israel wants us to. All right. Anyway, I was going to record another podcast episode tonight, but it's getting a little late, so I'll probably record it tomorrow instead. But I want to talk about Lori Loughlin, a.k.a. Aunt Becky, and what's going on with that and how I'm disgusted by that as well. So that'll be the next podcast episode coming, if not tomorrow, at some point this weekend. But thanks again for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review if you are enjoying it. And remember, you are a sovereign individual, and please remain vigilant on this stuff. Seek that knowledge out. The truth is out there. Just takes a little bit of work and digging to find it. Thanks, y'all.